If a wrestler is lucky, they'll get their moment in the sun one time during their careers. Sometimes, though, a performer can reinvent themselves in such a way that they have a complete career renaissance and go on to have a whole other run on top. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time Sting gave himself a whole second life when he transformed from Surfer to Crow. Not a literal crow, of course. No, rather, this was the period when Steve Borden became a much darker and moodier figure, inspired by Brandon Lee's performance in the cult 90s movie, unsurprisingly named The Crow. And the reason he needed to make this change at all was because the company he called home was entering a much edgier age. Why was this? Well, in the summer of 1996, Hulk Hogan's heel turn and subsequent alignment with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash to create the NWO had led to a dramatic shift in the power dynamics of WCW. Yes, now it was no longer about smiling good guys ruling the roost anymore. No, if you wanted to reach the top in this new era, then you had to have a badder attitude than that. Hell, even the faces would be swept up in this wave of 90s edge. So much so that someone who'd once been as colorful as Sting was forced to morph into a more monochrome incarnation. One which, as mentioned a moment ago, took his white painted face, long black hair, and black leather trench coat from Brandon Lee's titular character in The Crow. How did this change work out for him? Perfectly, as it happened, because all of a sudden, the former NWA World Champion became the top babyface in the entire industry. And what made this even sweeter for him was that he didn't have to wrestle a single match in order to reach such a peak. Instead, all he'd have to do would be to sit in the rafters for the next 18 months, quietly biding his time and waiting for the right moment to strike back against Hollywood Hogan and his cronies. And so successful was this whole method of getting over for him in the end, it led to The Crow becoming the incarnation Sting would be most well known for. In fact, when he joined up with AEW in December of 2020, he'd still be playing that version of himself rather than the old Surfer with the flat top haircut who'd first become famous back in the 80s. But of course, Sting isn't the only legend currently under contract with Tony Khan who found that rebranding himself allowed for a complete career renaissance. Though in the case of Billy Gunn, this change happened in Jacksonville itself, as it was there he went from being a new age outlaw to daddy ass. Yeah, wrestling's a weird sport. After all, where else could a man make millions of dollars by referring to himself as Mr. Ass? But for as strange as this may seem to an outsider, it's exactly what got Billy Gunn's toe over during the turn of the millennium. That said, such success could only last for so long, and so, by the time the 2010s came around, the Orlando native's time in the spotlight was beginning to come to an end. Or at least that's what everyone thought. Hell, by this point, even Billy had resigned himself to playing the role as a backstage trainer and producer. But when, while under the employ of AEW, he started working a few matches here and there again with his sons Austin and Colton, this would all change. What changed specifically? Well, once the Gunns got involved in a program with the Acclaimed, magic took place, as it was here the patriarch of the family started being referred to as Daddy Ass by Anthony Bowens, a reference to the fact that some fans had taken to labeling his sons the Ass Boys. And when Tony Khan realized how much chemistry Billy had with both Bowens and Max Caster, he decided to have him split from the Gunns and instead serve as their third, with this seeing them become one of the most over acts in the entire company. Seriously, you could argue that as Daddy Ass, the former tag team champion has never been more popular than he is now. So popular is he, in fact, at the time of this video's recording, he and his Acclaimed stablemates are the current AEW Trios champions. That's right, never let it be said that age has to slow you down if you're a wrestler, because at the rate he's going now, Billy Gunn will still be on top of the Jacksonville multi-man division well into his 60s. But then, we should have known this was a possibility, given the fact that another legend was proving middle age was just a starting point back in 2002. Who are we talking about here? Why, Ric Flair, and his time in Evolution, of course. Now, we don't have to tell any of you who Ric Flair is. After all, he's a 16-time plus world champion, the face of the Territory era, and arguably the greatest in-ring wrestler of all time. But while most of that success came during the 80s, the Nature Boy was far from done come the time he hit his 50s at the turn of the millennium. No, in his mind, he was only just getting started at this point. Sure, his long-term home of WCW may have gone out of business in 2001, but Slick Rick always had a good relationship with Vince McMahon. And that was why he was brought back into New York at this time then, with his initial task being to serve as the kayfabe co-owner of the company, a task which largely kept him in a non-wrestling role. As time went on, however, Rick's desire to return to the ring full-time got stronger, with this soon being noticed by Triple H. And so that was why, once the game began making plans to form a modern-day version of the Four Horsemen in 2002, he realized he needed his hero to be one of its members. Needless to say then, Flair would only be too happy to accept this spot once it was offered to him, as it allowed him a chance to completely revive himself and feel a little bit like the Nature Boy of old again for a few more years. Sure, he had aged by then, so he was a little bit slower than he had been during his heyday, but even with that in mind, Rick could still go at a rate most of his younger peers couldn't. With him having such success in the ring here, he'd even become a two-time tag team champion with his stablemate Dave Bautista. And his ability to keep going hard wasn't just limited to the squared circle either, as the stories of Evolution's partying antics behind the scenes have since become almost as legendary as that of the Horsemen's. But not every wrestler from the Territory era was such a hard drinker. No, some were all about healthy living and doing the right and moral thing at all costs. That said, while this was enough to make Bob Backlund a major babyface back in the late 70s and early 80s, come the time of his second run in the mid-90s, it actually had the opposite effect and turned him into an all-round excellent heel act. Yes, for people who were fans of Backlund during his run as WWF World Champion between February 1978 and December 1983, the idea he could ever have played a heel might have seemed shocking. And that was because he was such an all-American personification of everything good and pure at this point, you'd be forgiven for thinking he'd stepped off of the pages of Archie Comics. Of course, the 90s were a very different time though, even the mid-90s, as while we weren't fully into the anti-hero period of the Attitude Era by then, the idea of the Happy Days-esque white picket fence America was a thing of the past. And so when Bob Backlund returned to WWF to try and impart some of his wisdom onto younger stars like Bret Hart then, he found himself being treated like an old man yelling at clouds. Of course, the Minnesota native wasn't happy with this, and it soon led to him turning heel as he morphed into Mr. Backlund, a crazy old man who wanted nothing more than to teach those damn kids a lesson. How would he teach them this lesson? By stretching them in the ring, of course, usually with his crossface chicken wing finisher. And so well did this work out for him that by the end of 1994, he'd have regained the WWF title when he beat the Hitman for it via screwy means. That said, whether it was screwy or not mattered little to Bob. No, all that mattered now was that he'd proved he was still better than the younger generation, even if this meant turning his back on all his previous morals in order to do so. But not everyone has to turn their back on what made them who they were originally in order to go through a career revival, something our next subject proves. And the reason he proves this is because, whether it be his late 2000s incarnation or his more modern day character as a member of the Brawling Brutes, Sheamus is still wrestling in his hard-hitting style. With his recent career renaissance coming on account of fans appreciating this via some recent 5-star bouts he took part in. That's right, even as far back as his initial days in the company, Sheamus had been known for his heavy-hitting matches against the likes of Cesaro and Drew McIntyre. But while this hadn't gotten him as over as it should have then, in the current era, it's been more than enough to turn him into a superstar. Hell, so highly regarded is his style now, it's led to him forming the Brawling Brutes with fellow tough guy fighters Butch and Ridge Holland, a stable which has become one of the staples of SmackDown during Triple H's time with the book. And that's not all Sheamus has been doing during his career renaissance either, as he's also continued to stay strong in the singles division by having one of the best bouts WWE has seen in years against Gunther at September 2022's Clash at the Castle. Sadly though, no matter how hard he tried, the Dublin native would not be able to steal the Intercontinental title away from the former Walter at this point. No, if we want to find a performer whose second life in the ring led to him winning some gold, then we have to look to our next subject, none other than Kofi Kingston. Yes, while he was always a very talented wrestler, during the first phase of his career during the late 2000s and large part of the 2010s, Kofi Kingston was never someone who seemed to be able to break through that glass ceiling. Was that because Vince McMahon didn't see him at such a level? Possibly. But if the Yes Movement taught us anything, it was that even if the boss wasn't all in on one of his roster members, if fans pushed back hard enough, then they could force his hand. And that's exactly what happened in 2018, as it was here that after a star-making performance inside the Elimination Chamber, Kofi Mania suddenly caught fire. But what made this one even more unlikely was that Kingston was never even meant to be in the match in the first place. No, instead, his spot was meant to be filled by Mustafa Ali before he got injured at the last minute. That said, even if it was an accident, the Ghanaian-born star took the opportunity and ran with it, as over the next 2 months, he'd get live crowds so behind him, WWE were forced to change their WrestleMania plans at the last minute and have Kofi Kingston challenge Daniel Bryan for the WWE title instead of Kevin Owens. And you all know what happened next. In one of the greatest feel-good moments in company history, the New Day member toppled the American Dragon in just under 24 minutes to make history and begin his first reign on top. Sure, the title run which came after this wouldn't be able to live up to that magic moment, but even if Kofi Mania ended up sputtering out over the course of the summer, none of this will ever be able to take away from the fact that the sheer will of fans alone caused Kingston to have a mega career resurgence right at the time it was most needed. Of course, not every fan revolt leads to the performer in question reaching the top of the card, however. No, sometimes even this fails to get them to that next level. But if you're someone like Zack Ryder, you can always get around such a problem by simply leaving WWE behind and transforming yourself for the better as Matt Cardona, King of the Indies. Now, if you only follow WWE, then you might not be aware that Zack Ryder has had a complete revival of fortune since his release from the company in 2020. And that's because while in New York, he was only ever really portrayed as an undercard act who occasionally got thrown a bone in terms of something more significant. Outside of the system, he's been able to flourish in a way that his fans always knew he could. It doesn't matter if it's Impact, Major League Wrestling, the National Wrestling Alliance, or Game Changer Wrestling, Cardona has been a success story everywhere he's went. So much so, in fact, that in 3 of the 4 companies we just mentioned, he's held gold, and in 2 of those, that gold has been a world title. And when you take into account the fact that GCW is the home of deathmatch wrestling performed by the likes of walking lunatic Nick Gage, then this is an even more impressive feat, as who could have ever foreseen Long Island Ice Z as being someone who would thrive in such an environment. But whether anyone could have foreseen it or not, it happened, and now, no longer being seen as a WWE guy, the New Yorker has been able to gain a cool factor which wasn't there even back in 2011 when he was more over than he had ever been in Vince McMahon's company. The only question now, then, is where does he go from here? Does he continue to reign as one of the top stars of the indie circuit, following in the footsteps of the likes of Chris Hero and Tracy Smothers? Or does he go for the big money again by attempting to get a full-time contract with WWE once more? All we can do at this point is wait and see what the future holds for Matt Cardona. That said, whatever he does, one thing is for sure, and this is that he's no longer going to be seen as an afterthought on account of the work he's been able to do out on the indies. But then that very same thing could be said of our next subject too, because despite spending the majority of their career as a tag team act in the likes of WWF, WCW, and Impact, once he transformed into the French Frankenstein in 2018, PCO truly became a main event player. Honestly, no one could have seen this one coming ahead of time. After all, who could have ever imagined Pierre-Carl Ouellet, one half of the Quebecers, would have had such a resurgence so late in his career? Sure, he was always a capable performer, but he was never really able to put that final piece of the puzzle together in order to reach his full potential. And that meant his most notable moment during the first phase of his career was arguably the fact he was booked to take part in the Brawl for All despite only having one functioning eye. Luckily though, this would all change as the 2010s drew to a close, because it was at this point, while out working on the indies, that Ouellet decided to change things up by putting on a Scott Steiner level of muscle and transforming into a Terminator-esque figure whose whole gimmick was that he absolutely could not be killed. Sound silly? That's because it was, in the best possible way. And it was the sheer ridiculousness of a giant 50-year-old one-eyed French-Canadian powering his way through opponents and using things like electric shocks to bring himself back to life whenever he was put down that led to Ring of Honor taking interest and signing him up to a full-time contract not long thereafter. Of course there, PCO wouldn't just be another member of the roster though. No, he'd be one of the top draws in the entire company for a while, with him at one point even winning the ROH World title when he beat Rush for that honor. And even after losing that belt back to El Toro Blanco a couple of months later, he's continued to find success by winning gold in the likes of the NWA and GCW too. But not every career resurgence happens out on the indie circuit. No, quite often a performer doesn't have to leave the major leagues in order to do this. And if you need another example of such a thing being the case, you only have to look at what happened on 2006 SmackDown, as it was there that Booker T shook things up by winning the King of the Ring, and in the process transforming into King Booker. Yes, it's true that Booker T was undeniably great before this, Hell, by the mid-2000s he was already a 5-time WCW champion and the man who gave us such classic segments as the Supermarket Brawl with Steve Austin and the unfortunate interview where he had a few choice accidental words for Hulk Hogan. That said, he really reached another level altogether when he completely reworked his character to reflect his newly earned monarch status. How did he change things up exactly? Well, first by wearing a cape and crown down to the ring every night and adopting a ludicrous English accent. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he'd also collect a king's court around him in the form of Sir William Regal, Sir Fit Finlay, Court Jester Hornswoggle, and of course his wife, Queen Sharmell. And with those people around him then, Booker was able to go all the way to the top by winning the World Heavyweight title from Rey Mysterio at that July's Great American Bash pay-per-view, a role which Vince McMahon had never trusted him with up until this point. Yes, even the boss was getting behind the Houston native in full now, as with this new gimmick, it was undeniable King Booker was the best thing going on the Blue brand. Really, the only thing which could slow him down anymore would be himself, as, only a year later, both he and Sharmell would leave WWE after they'd become burnt out with the schedule they were being asked to work. And that's a true shame, because had they stayed on at this point, who knows how high Booker could have risen in the company's pecking order. Maybe he could have eventually even turned babyface and started approaching John Cena levels of popularity. But if he had stuck around, he wouldn't have been the only one angling for the top spot, as by 2011, another star was undergoing a late career renaissance when he turned heel and began inducting all of his opponents into the Hall of Pain. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Mark Henry. Now, we're not going to say Mark Henry was terrible during the first phase of his WWE career between 1996 and 2011. After all, he certainly had his moments where he was entertaining, such as his bizarre May-December romance with Mae Young. That said, for as big as the hype was around him when he was initially signed, he never quite managed to live up to expectations. Thank God his contract was so long-term then, because after a decade and a half on the roster, things finally clicked in full for the big man when, upon joining SmackDown and turning heel in the process, it occurred to him that he was the world's strongest man, and so no one should be able to beat him in a fight. So armed with this knowledge, Henry started working his way through the Blue brand with ease, as during each match, he'd formally inducted his opponent for the night into his Hall of Pain. Obviously then, at some point, this was going to put him in line for a title shot against then World Heavyweight Champion Randy Orton. And when the time for that bout finally came at September 2011's Night of Champions, Mark made sure the Viper felt his full wrath. So much did the champ feel it, in fact, by the time things were all said and done, the world's strongest man would be holding the top prize above his head for the first time in his career, and as a result, would be able to show everyone who'd ever believed in him that they were right all along.